Frank, lovely to see. I've got some photos.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Katarzyna Pisarska. I'm the chair of the Warsaw Security Forum. It is my immense pleasure to be leading this session, a session that I think is of utter importance for the future of the European security architecture and the world security architecture, which is, of course, Ukraine's membership in NATO. I would like to invite to the stage our marvelous panel. With us today here is Eivind van Petersson, who is the Secretary of State in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway. We also have Kajsa Ollongren, who is the former Minister of Defense of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Volker is coming back, of course, to the stage, former US ambassador to NATO. And last but definitely not least, our wonderful Ukrainian guest that's joining us, member of the Verkhovna Rada, Olena Khomenko. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
So first and foremost, a very important strategic information. We will not be using Slido. Instead, I would really want to take questions from the audience. There is going to be a mic here, and we really would want to have this panel more as a discussion where we can actually navigate through a few ideas and questions, because the panel is really about the future, isn't it? It's about the things we might and can and should be doing, not only in the question of NATO enlargement, but as we'll see in a number of other areas. But let me start with a few questions to you before we'll turn it straight to the audience. And of course, we'll start with the main question of the panel, NATO enlargement. How realistic today is Ukraine joining NATO in the foreseeable future? We've seen the debacle happening in the Vilnius summit a year ago. And if I can start with you, Kajsa, and then I'll go to the State Secretary.
Well, I think we must be perfectly honest and clear about it. We have promised Ukraine that they will become member of NATO. We have said in Vilnius, it's not a question of if, but when. After that, two things happened. I think most countries have bilateral security arrangements with Ukraine, which is very relevant and also a direct result of commitments that we all made. And there was the Washington summit. And at the Washington summit, there was a step, the so-called Ukraine Compact. I wonder if it is, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, of course, because if you have lots of bilateral agreements, it's good to have some kinds of oversight, and I think the Compact provides just that. But it's not the membership. I think what is more important is now the partnership that NATO has with Ukraine and the possibilities that it offers to cooperate with Ukraine. And I think the real question is not when will Ukraine be a real, de jure NATO member, but will we have the situation that Ukraine becomes a de facto NATO member? Ukraine asks NATO to do training inside of Ukraine. President Zelensky asks NATO members, NATO allies, to step up their engagement with Ukraine. I'm sure we're going to debate that also this afternoon. And I think little by little, you will see that this partnership that we have with Ukraine is not only in their interest, it's also in our interest. Ukraine is a country that is actually fighting a war with NATO capabilities more and more, that we have provided them with. And they are the country that have the war-fighting experience with these capabilities. At this moment, we are learning from Ukraine also when it comes to high-tech and the use of our capabilities in actual wartime situations. So it is in our interest to keep them very, very close, and that open-door policy, we must also make it reality.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask straight away, before Eivind, give us a second, I wanted actually to ask Kurt here, because I think here we'll agree that Ukraine will be an added value to NATO, yes? But that's not what we're hearing in Washington, D.C. Very often we hear that NATO enlargement to Ukraine is an additional security burden for the United States. What would you say, Kurt?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that that's not what you're hearing in Washington, D.C.
And Berlin, by the way. I didn't say that.
Yeah, or Berlin. But the problem is that people in Washington and Berlin are thinking very defensively and reactively and worrying about any kind of escalation, and so they're afraid to do anything. And we have to get out of this mindset And we have to say, first off, we have a problem that we have the biggest war going on in Europe since NATO was founded. We have to stop that. And secondly, we need to get back to a situation where there is peace in Europe. And the only way you do that is you end this war, you bring Ukraine into NATO, and there's a border and there's no more war because Russia's deterred. So that's what we have to get to. So we can't think of NATO, of Ukraine joining NATO as something that happens after the war's over. Mm-hmm. We have to think of Ukraine joining NATO as part of the strategy for ending the war.
But that's not the discussions we're having. That's not the discussions we're hearing from Washington.
We should all go vote.
Okay, I mean, back to you. Tell me, of course, Norway has been not only a member of NATO but also supportive of Ukraine immensely. You know, what do you see when it comes to security guarantees for Ukraine? What are the options? Is NATO the only option?
No, not the only one. Let me be very clear. I mean, your original question, yes, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. But until that day, there's so much we must and should do as well. The obvious, but just let me reiterate it, is that we need to continue to step up the material support here now to make sure that Ukraine can stay in this fight and drive the Russian invasion out. But while I remain committed to, yes, Ukraine will join, there is much we can do. I can't remember the number of countries that signed security assurances agreements. That's a track. And there are a lot of other interesting ideas on how we can move as NATO countries and Ukraine closer together, even now while the war is still ongoing.
Mm-hmm. So, and I think here it is critical to ask, I mean, is Norway would support NATO membership for Ukraine starting from tomorrow, just like Kurt says, during the war? And how do you think that should look like?
To be perfectly honest, not tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And when?
Let me put it this way. All allies are equal, but one ally is somewhat more equal than the others.
I think we got your point. Thank you. Okay, now I think to the most important voice in this discussion, the Ukrainian voice. If you could tell us, Olena, what are the moods now in Kiev when you discuss NATO membership? And there has been so much discussions over the last 2 years. Again, you know, a huge debacle at the Vilnius summit where there was a lot of expectations and not much delivered. I think that was toned down. We saw in Washington, D.C. for a variety of reasons, including domestic political campaigning in the U.S. But you know, what is the roadmap, do you think, for NATO enlargement?
You asked about the mood, and the mood of Ukrainians is that Ukraine's membership in NATO is irreversible, it is crucial, it is needed, it is vital, and not only for Ukraine but for the alliance itself. And Russian threat exists in Europe as long as there is a security gap and in the Eastern Europe, and as long as there is temptation of Russian dictators to conquer and to expand their imperialistic influence at the expense of security gap in Europe. So this can be solved once and for all when Ukraine joins NATO. And with regard to Ukraine's compact, this is the new level. This takes our relations with our partners to the new level, and it complements to the new security architecture. And this confirms that the system of bilateral security agreements is working, and while Ukraine is paving its path to NATO.
So, Olena, you're happy with the compact? You're satisfied with the compact?
Yes, we are happy, but I mean, we are happy with the compact, but this doesn't mean that this That's we need to postpone and to think about membership in NATO as a future perspective. So this is the solution for now.
Thank you. Kajsa, what do you think about the compact as it is? Because I know you've been critical about this.
Well, critical maybe, I mean, if Ukraine is happy with the compact, I'm happy with the compact, because it is indeed a new step, and there had to be an outcome
Could you maybe
from the
explain
Washington
a bit
summit.
to the audience what the compact is? Because I think a lot of even the security experts don't really know what we talk about.
But I think that's one of the main problems.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what it is. Yeah. And I think it was agreed in Washington. It was a deliverable for Ukraine at the Washington summit. And it is also because it is staying short of the actual membership. And I think the compact, as I said, arranges all those bilateral agreements, but we already had the partnership. So it is a bit, I mean, it's not nice to say, but it's a bit of window dressing. But what is more important to me is that if we talk too much about when will the actual membership happen, we're going to see that all kinds of problems will arise, because not only is one of the NATO allies, of course, more equal than the others, there are also NATO allies that will raise all kinds of questions. We have seen it. It took Sweden a year and a half, I think, to join NATO. There were many countries who supported it, who put their parliamentary approval in weeks or in months' time on the table, but it was blocked.
Or days.
Or even days, exactly.
Hours.
But so we know there are countries who will try to block this. And there's also the Ukrainian side, because if there would be countries that would demand of Ukraine to give up, for instance, territory to be able to join NATO, Ukraine would rightly, I think, say no. We will not give up territory only to join NATO. So I think we should avoid all of that. I think we should be very practical. Okay. We have our partnership. We have the perspective of actual membership. They will be a member. And in the meantime, we're going to use whatever we can, whatever room there is as NATO or as NATO partners to engage with Ukraine and to help Ukraine to win this war.
Excellent. And my last question about NATO enlargement is, what do you say to the many, many people who say, well, enlarging NATO to Ukraine means that we end up in Third World War? Yeah, today. Kurt, you said that it should be happening.
Right. I think
take us through the process. Like,
sure.
you know, you would be taking to the American public.
Let me quickly address a couple of additional points, and then I'll come back to that. First off, the reason NATO membership for Ukraine was not a controversial issue at the Washington summit was because the US and Germany spent most of the beginning of this year telling countries, don't you dare bring this up at the Washington summit. And similarly, the reason I think that Ukraine is happy with the compact is because the US has told Ukrainians, you better go out and say you're happy with this compact. The reality is that the compact is not legally binding. It is not a treaty. It has a 10-limit sunset clause, and it doesn't have any operational clause. So what happens if we have to defend Ukraine? So it's about the equivalent of the Budapest Memorandum, and we know how that worked out.
Ouch.
Now, in terms of how you avoid World War III, if Putin is continuing the war in Ukraine and reasonably successful, even if he doesn't take Kyiv, but he's continuing to fight and he continues to strengthen Russian forces, he has an appetite for all of the former Russian Empire. His election campaign in Moscow was based on the slogan, Russia has no borders. So if we don't stop Putin, we will have World War III. So the way to avoid World War III is to stop Putin and stop him now in Ukraine. If we can do that, then we need a permanent peace. And the way you have a permanent peace is deterrence. You bring a country like Ukraine into NATO, the most capable military in Europe, and most battle-hardened as it is anyway, get them in, and then you won't have future wars. That's how you avoid World War III.
Yeah. Okay, but still I have to press on this, and I hope the other panels will help you. Deterrence, and you know that best, is only as credible as we are able to deliver on the threat of actually helping the ally. Do you believe that if there's Article 5, that even just like with West Germany is only about a certain part of Ukraine territory, we can do that? And if Russia does decide to test us in Ukraine in a few years, do you believe that we will be able to recall Article 5 and have boots on the ground, NATO boots on the ground?
Yeah, I had the same debates about Poland joining NATO in the 1990s and about Lithuania joining NATO, being invited in 2002. It's a question of, do you believe you will do what you say you will do? And the answer is, you have to mean it when you say it. Now, there are ways, and this was alluded to, I think, by Kajsa here. There are ways to start defining, okay, so in the case of Ukraine, because it is partially occupied, what exactly does Article 5 mean in this case? And former Secretary General Rasmussen has put out ideas on limiting the application of Article 5 to territory that the government actually controls now, and NATO not participating in the use of military force to retake territory. That's one way to look at that. Another way to look at that is to simply say, as the NATO treaty does, Article 5 does not specifically mandate what your collective defense response is. It says there will be one, doesn't say what it is. So we're already doing a lot of what we would do under Article 5 for any ally, providing training, equipment, assistance, finances, etc. There are more things that we could and should do, such as in the area of air defense and freedom of naval operations and presence of NATO forces. A lot of more things that we could do without necessarily meaning we're sending ground troops to go fight and shoot at Russians. So that's something we could talk about with Ukraine. But we haven't even started this conversation in the NATO-Ukraine Council because we're stuck in this mode of saying, oh, no, we can't do anything until after the war.
Thank you very much. And I have to go to first, governmental official and former governmental official. Can you imagine your armies with boots on the ground in Ukraine? Shall we start with the former so it's easier? Can you imagine a scenario?
Not today, not tomorrow.
Okay.
But I can imagine Norwegian NATO troops cooperating with the Ukrainian NATO troops in the future training exercise scenario.
Because we did have a number of countries, including Estonia, and to some extent also Emmanuel Macron has alluded to this, imagining already today, without NATO membership, boots on the ground, not in active combat, but for example, protecting the Ukrainian-Belarusian border from an intrusion from the north. Is that something that your government would be pondering at all?
We can ponder a lot of things, but the policy remains no boots on the ground. We are firm, strong supporters of Ukraine, but we're not party to the war.
Kajsa?
Well, I can speak a little bit more freely, being former Minister of Defense. I think if you look at the situation, we are doing a lot. We are providing weapons, ammunition, and training. And there is not a real difference between training Ukrainian soldiers in Poland or in Germany towards training them in Ukraine. So if that would really be helpful for Ukraine, I would not object to that. So that is a step where you go inside Ukraine. Of course, it creates dilemmas because those training areas would become target areas for the Russians. Not legitimate targets, but they would use it, of course, because they target everything. And there you have to solve that before you can start this type of cooperation inside of Ukraine. And I think when our parliament, for instance, says no boots on the ground, they mean no army fighting in Ukraine. That's different to training in Ukraine. And I think also in the field of air defense, I think what we saw this week, the air attacks, the whole country was targeted again. The energy infrastructure is going to be a huge problem this winter. Innocent civilians in the whole of Ukraine are suffering. It is unacceptable. And I think we have to look into new ways to help Ukraine there.
Excellent. I'll get back to you with that, but I wanted to ask Olena, what are your expectations today? Not about NATO, but concrete help. I know that your government is currently doing, a huge communication offensive in the Western countries about protecting Ukrainian skies by many means, not only delivering more batteries, but also looking at potentially protecting at least Western skies of Ukraine from NATO territory, including from Poland. I mean, could you tell us more about these expectations?
To eliminate security gap, we first need to fully implement the signed security guarantees, agreements, supply of weapons, sanctions against Russia, and long-term financial support for Ukraine. But also it is necessary to provide Ukraine with a long-range capability so that we will be able to prevent Russian terroristic attacks, and we need to target their military airfields, ammunition stockhouse, warehouses, bases, and logistics, and also reliable supply for the front, timely execution of what have already been promised. So these are crucial points.
Absolutely. Kajsa, if I can go back to you, are we delivering on this? I mean, there's been a lot of discussions that we're limiting Ukraine when it comes to the long-range missiles striking Russian territory, from where these missiles are coming, but also the question of, us really starting to protect at least parts of the Ukrainian sky. How realistic are these things? Do you think they're going to happen within the next year, having in mind, of course, the American electoral cycle and so on and so forth?
Yeah, of course. I think, well, my point is we should really lift all restrictions on the use of these long-range weapons and ammunition. Absolutely. Because I think it's really unacceptable the way that we see that Ukraine is targeted now, the way that gliding bombs, for instance, have been used. Ukraine cannot fight with one or even two arms tied on its back. So we have to raise those restrictions. We have to continue to argue with our American friends, especially, who still are reluctant. And I understand the politics and the elections coming up and everything, but if we're serious about we want Ukraine to win this war, or even if you say we don't want Russia to win, then you have to lift those restrictions. So that is vital. And I think the second part of the question is, of course, more difficult, because then you have to answer to those countries who would say, but then there is no way that we could be part of air defense without being part in the war. And I think that has to be debated, but I believe that there are ways to deal with this.
And Kurt, this discussion is happening in Poland. We have had so far at least 6 missiles and a drone last week entering Polish territory, as far as 400, 500 kilometers into Polish territory. So this is serious. I mean, and of course the Ukrainians are, and we're not shooting down even these targets. I know you had a great idea of how could actually Poland and countries such as Poland start to think about not only our territory, but also defending at least parts of Ukrainian sky.
Yeah, it's important that we frame this question the right way. Most people have brought up this question of, well, should we help Ukraine defend its airspace? Should NATO play a direct role in Ukraine's air defense? That's the wrong way to think about this. The reality is that we have Poland and we have Romania, and Russia has repeatedly violated the airspace of both countries. It has had incidents where one of them was a Russian missile was flying around in Poland before eventually going into Ukraine to hit something. And debris has fallen in both countries and caused damages, and in the case of Poland, the loss of 2 lives. This is an unacceptable threat to NATO territory and populations, and what NATO ought to be talking about, and Poland and Romania could very well do, is seek permission from Ukraine to extend their air defenses into Ukrainian territory by a certain distance. And I would say the distance should be measured by reaction time. So maybe 100 kilometers, maybe 300 kilometers. But if there are potential threats to NATO territory and populations in that area, we have permission from Ukraine to shoot them down. And that is something that NATO should do for its own defense, for the Polish population, for the Romanian population, and it's something where there would be no justification for any kind of retaliation against Poland or Romania, and therefore no reason why other countries in NATO would call into question for 1 second whether Article 5 would be applying to Poland and Romania. This is about assuring NATO's actual mission.
But but sources say that Ukraine already has given that permission, and that some countries, including my own, were debating this, including at the beginning of the NATO summit. Yet this has been blocked by one big NATO member state.
And look, we're going to run into this problem of one big NATO member state blocking everything. And I think we first need to not be deterred by ourselves. We need to actually address the issues that are there. But secondly, I think we do need to frame this the right way. I think it would be a good thing for NATO to help Ukraine with its air defense. But we're not going to get consensus on that from a lot of countries, and that would be NATO playing a direct role in the conflict. But for NATO to do its own job, I mean, imagine that Ukraine is an ocean. Of course we'd be taking out, missiles and drones that are flying 100 kilometers off our coast. Why wouldn't we do that in the case of Ukraine if the Ukrainians say it's okay?
Thank you very much. I wanted really to open the floor to questions. Do we have already first questions? Yes, we do, of course. So let's start from this side. I think Tobias Elwood, then there's a lady back there. Let's try to do 2 questions at a time, and then we'll go to the other side of the room. So first 2 questions, and then the others. Please introduce yourself. And
thank you very much. Tobias Elwood, a former foreign minister for the United Kingdom. One quick observation, talking about NATO, very much support that for Ukraine. Why not invite Ukraine to join the Joint Expeditionary Force? For those who aren't familiar with it, this is NATO Light, if you like, and I think there's representation on the panel already. That would be an easy stepping stone in order to advance further membership into NATO. That could be done immediately. It doesn't require any veto whatsoever. My question is actually to do with risk averseness. I've operated as a soldier in a number of NATO missions. None of them are in NATO. They were outside of NATO. And yet, because this was Russia, then we were spooked by Putin's rhetoric. It's taken some time for us to build up capability to look Putin in the eye and say, we're going to deliver NLAWs, we're going to deliver tanks, we're going to deliver training, we're going to deliver F-16s and indeed Brimstone, Storm Shadows and ATACMS. Let's go a step further now, and you touched on it, sir. Rather than just defending NATO airspace, why don't we do as we did in setting the precedent with Iran when they fired drones and missiles at Israel? Why not now protect Ukraine's airspace by taking out drones and missiles, not airplanes, over that sovereign territory as well? Otherwise, they will blast the infrastructure again, and time is running out because of all the geopolitical considerations that's been mentioned already. That would be an astute, progressive, determined step to look at Putin in the eye and say enough is enough.
thank you very much. Thanks, Tobias. Excellent question. And the lady in the back, if we can pass it, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mirta Groeneveld. I'm from the NATO Command and Control Center of Excellence. And I just have a question on NATO has the ambition to have a much broader role than just the traditional kinetic military threats alone. So do you think that NATO nations are de facto already at war with Russia today? If we look at the cyber domain, hybrid warfare and the information space, and is it then a fair point that in this realm the current comprehensive approach towards all these threats between all European nations might be just as important as an Article 5 to keep us safe?
Thank you very much. And I think that question comes back and forth. So let's start, Eivind, let's start from the back. Are we at war with Russia today, given the amount of hybrid activities that Russia has waged upon us, which are absolutely increasing, yes, and they become much, much more pronounced, and they probably will in the months to come?
Well, let me turn it around. I think it's fair to say that Vladimir Putin believes he's at war with us. Yes. And that has, of course, consequences that everyone in this room is aware of. Still, technically, legally, international law-wise, we are, of course, not at war with Russia. Russia has launched a war of aggression against Ukraine. We are supporters of Ukraine, but again, we're not party to the conflict. But it's obvious, but it's an important reminder that security in the 21st century is much more than just Article 5, of course.
Do you feel your society is aware of the fact that Russia sees itself in war with the West? And do you have this type of discussions? You know, what does that mean?
It has been observed that many countries in Europe, we were sort of in a deep peace, almost asleep. The awakening has happened, faster for some than for others, also within my own country. We are in a completely different place now than what we were a few years ago. And I speak with colleagues, and I am very much aware of all the information when it comes to disinformation, conspiracies. Speaking from my own country, honestly, that's not my number one priority, my number one worry, because we find ourselves in a position where, luckily, there's still significant trust, and there's not really any fertile ground whatsoever for these Russian conspiracies or disinformation campaigns.
Thank you very much. Kajsa, what do you think about Tobias's ideas, you know, in terms of strengthening Ukrainians' involvement into what NATO is already doing on the one side, but also, you know, why aren't we creating an Iron Dome if we're doing that for Israel?
Absolutely. It's a good question. And also, you mentioned JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, the Northern European countries under UK leadership. I think there has been some debate about whether or not Ukraine should join. And I think at that point, both Ukraine and the JEF countries agreed that there are already so many institutions. There's the EU, there's NATO, where Ukraine is at the table, sitting at the table. There will always be a place at the table at JEF also for Ukraine, but it doesn't seem very logical looking at the capabilities that the JEF nations put on the table and the added value that they have for NATO, so therefore also for Ukraine. So that's why they have not asked to join JEF, but just I wanted, because I liked very much that you mentioned it. But to the risk averseness, I think, well, at some point, I mean, you have to calculate risks, of course. And I think in the beginning, 2.5 years ago, this whole nuclear aspect, because that is the whole reason, of course, of the risk averseness, we all had to take it serious. And we still have to. But I think, and I come back to the point of what NATO really is about. NATO, if NATO functions, it is because of deterrence, and it's also because of nuclear deterrence. The war in Ukraine is very serious, but the rhetoric, Putin's rhetoric on nuclear, is rhetoric. And I think we have to take that more into our calculus about what we can do and what we should do. I don't think that it is in our interest that we see sort of this stalemate continuing in Ukraine. It is not in our interest that at some point people are going to accept that part of Ukraine are annexed by Russia. And therefore, we have to take more risks, absolutely. And that is where we have to start the public debate also, that taking these risks does not bring World War III. It is not going to bring us into a nuclear war. And the other way around, if we don't step in and do more now, then it's going to threaten us even more in the future. So we have to have that long-term vision on risk assessment.
Yeah. Thank you. And at this point, I would actually also like to hear from Olena, because you're nodding and saying, you know, we're not afraid of World War III. But most importantly, I mean, what is today the discussion on the use of nuclear weapons by Russia? Because if it's a tactical strike, it is on Ukraine. Are the Ukrainians afraid of that?
Let me answer in this way, that the operation in Kursk region proves that there are no real risks of escalation, and there are no Russian red lines. Our armed forces created a buffer security zone on the Russian territory, and Putin's only reaction was pretending that nothing special is happening. So this is the fact that Putin has already used all his potential, I mean, all his bluff narratives for so-called escalation. So this is now important to simply push Russia towards a just peace. So we are just, this is our position.
Thank you. Kurt, I really wanted to ask you about the Kursk incursion.
Okay.
Tell me, what is your assessment? What has been won? What has been lost? And what is the Western reaction to what's happening currently in Kursk?
Yeah. Can I address a couple of the thoughts that came up as well? I completely agree. Russia is at war with NATO, and NATO is not at war with Russia. And we need to wake up and maybe even have some coffee. We have to be a little bit more energetic here. And just to spell it out, Russia has engaged in cyber attacks in our countries, arson, funding demonstrations, political interference, bribery, corruption, targeted assassinations on our territory. This, at a minimum, should demand an Article 4 consultation at NATO about what Russia is doing to our countries. And so far, we are not doing that. Second, I completely agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman from Bournemouth East. We should be helping Ukraine with its air defenses. Absolutely. Problem is, I don't think it's possible to get NATO to agree to this right now. I do think it's possible to get NATO to agree to protect its own territory and populations. So that's why I frame it that way. But I agree with where he's going on that. And as far as Kursk goes, several things are important that are not what Putin wants us to be talking about. It demonstrates that Russia is at the limit of its capabilities. It can't attack Ukraine and defend Russia at the same time. It's had to make a choice. It's going to have to move forces from Ukraine to defend Russia. That movement is something we should be taking advantage of with long-range systems to hit them while they move. Russia does not have the ability to escalate. We always worry about escalation. The moment Ukraine invades Russian territory, we suddenly discover that this is not that important, don't worry about it, because there's no ability to escalate. It blows a hole in the narrative that this is a sanitary special military operation. It's actually a war, and people in Russia can see it. When you have 200,000 of your own people having to be displaced because of a military invasion of your country, that's not something that gets unnoticed. It demonstrates to Western countries, or at least it should, that the aid that we provide to Ukraine gets used well, and it doesn't create a nuclear war. We should learn from that. It changes the dynamic of any future negotiation, because until that Kursk invasion, the dialogue about a negotiation was always about how much does Ukraine give up? Russia's going to gain something, how much? And now it is more the question of a trade. Russia has to give something up in order to get something as well. That has not been the case before. And finally, I just want to comment on the nuclear question too, because nobody wants to see the use of nuclear weapons. We don't want nuclear weapons to be regularized as an instrument of war. But at the same time, if you look at Mariupol, if you look at Bakhmut, it's hard-pressed to say what's the difference.
Yeah. Thank you. Very, very strong point. We have 5 minutes and 44 seconds, so I'll take 2 questions. If you promise, each is going to take 20 seconds. Please here, and then the second, and then we're going to wrap up with that.
Charles Tannock, Globsec Fellow. 24 years ago, I wrote an article about a country I termed the Cuba of Europe. And it hasn't come up much in debate, but we fully accept that Ukraine should be in NATO if it prevails and Putin is defeated. But what about Belarus? Because Belarus and its dictator has survived 24 years, which nobody could have predicted, including myself 24 years ago. He's still there. Will Belarus also be given a pathway to NATO? It will certainly be given a pathway to the European Union, but there can't really be regional security unless Belarus also joins the NATO alliance, in my view.
Thank you very much. And if you can pass the mic to Ben. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Benjamin Tallis, Democratic Strategy Initiative, Berlin. So many of us, I think, would agree with so much of what's been said on the panel. But the key question now is how we get from should to did, and what is actually holding us back. Why is it that some countries, such as Poland, the Baltic states, and others who have mainstreamed Ukraine's victory into their strategic picture are not being followed? And why is it that the US and Germany, who haven't done that, are still calling the shots? Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to go reverse now. Kurt, with you, a minute, 20 seconds. Choose your question.
Yeah. The easy answer to your question, Ben, is the US and Germany call the shots because we have the resources. The harder question is, why are we the most afraid when we are the furthest away with the most capability? And the countries that are right on the front line are the most bullish in saying we have to do this and we have to do it now. So there is something wrong in our analysis and our excessive caution, in my view. We are governed by our fears rather than being governed by purpose. Belarus, with a new regime in Belarus, yes. It's like saying, if Jaruzelski's still in Poland, do you want them to join NATO? No. But a democratic, law-abiding, prosperous Poland, of course, should be a member of NATO, and the same for Belarus as well. But we're not going to get there. I think so much of what's happening in this part of the world now hinges on Ukraine's victory. And the future of Belarus, the future of Georgia, the future of Moldova, all hinge on getting Ukraine right.
Thank you very much. Olena, last words.
With regards to the question about Belarus, I think that it's not feasible in the foreseen future that Belarus will become the member of NATO because Belarus and Russia, they are all about the same, and I don't see, as of now, I don't see this perspective.
Thank you, Kajsa.
Well, good that Belarus was mentioned, and also Moldova should be mentioned, because Russia has different approaches to different countries. Belarus is already in the sphere of influence. Moldova is sort of, well, we'll see with the elections coming up, but they're using everything, bribes, disinformation, and every pressure they can put on that country to win the elections in their advantage, the Russian advantage. I hope not. And there are other ways also in elections in the US and other countries are probably also influenced by Russian disinformation. So that is happening also, and that's also a war, a type of war that is currently happening. On why aren't we there yet? I think we have to be realistic that it's often politics. There are elections in several countries. There are political constellations that block that type of decision-making, at least fast decision-making. But I think you have seen that in the end we do get there. It is too slow and the Ukrainians are suffering. But in the end, the inevitable does happen. And I think that is why we will see, if we are serious about that Russia cannot win the war, Ukraine has to win the war. Ukraine has all of our capabilities now. We will get there. So if we just succeed in lifting the restriction for the long-range weapons, if we start thinking about the ideas like, that was presented now, turn it around, then the political debate might end up in an agreement. And so I think I'm confident that we will make those steps.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And the last word goes to ivind.
Well, the Biden administration is not here to speak for itself, but let me share you an observation I picked up from within it to signify that to show that it's not a monolith. The observation was that in the State Department, the #1 priority is for Ukraine to win this war. In the Pentagon, the #1 priority is for Russia to lose this war. While in the White House and National Security Council, the #1 priority is to avoid World War III. Personally, speaking for my government, I agree with all those 3 points. But it's an illustration, yes, that there are. It's not a monolith. and we'll have to wait until January next year to see what happens further as well.
Absolutely, and that is almost days away in terms of big politics. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause to this fantastic panel. And now we invite you to stay because we're going to continue to speak about Ukraine. The next session is on demining Ukraine, a critical, important element, and that starts in just a moment. The moderator is Martin Sklenar. Thank you, everyone, and see you for the next session.